Welcome to BIX Tech TV. My name is Charles Green, or Charlie Green, now that we've met. I'm talking to you today mainly because I co-wrote a book called The Trusted Advisor many years ago. And I wrote a follow-up book called Trust-Based Selling. And you can gather from those titles, it has to do with trust in business, a brief bit about myself, and then we can dive into talking about the topics. I'm an American, you can tell already. I got an undergraduate degree in philosophy. I got an MBA from Harvard Business School. I spent 20 years in the industry of management consulting. And then in my mid-40s, I combined with two other guys, and we wrote the book that I mentioned, The Trusted Advisor, which within business circles did pretty well. It's about 500,000 copies over 20 plus years. We did a 20th anniversary edition of The Trusted Advisor. And my second career was doing workshops and keynote speeches and consulting and coaching on issues of trust in business. And I think most of you on this call instinctively would agree that if your clients trust you, things go a lot better. And I'm not going to go into great detail about how and why. I'm just going to assume that it's a desirable thing, and instead talk to you about the dynamics of trust and trusted relationships, particularly trust-based selling in business. And just to set it up, give you my perspective, my bias, I find that there's a lot written, even more these days than there was 20 years ago, about trust. Most of it I find somewhat confusing, sloppy, messy, vague, imprecise. And what I'd like to do is make it very simple, break it down, and give you very clear ways to think about trust that are practical, based in common sense, don't require a lot of statistics, measurements, and so forth. So that's my bias, commonsensical and simplify and keep it practical. My friends here at BIX Tech have together with me put together a bunch of questions, and they're good questions. I'm just going to kind of go through them in order. And the first one here, what are the fundamental building blocks of trust in a professional relationship, and how can these be established from the outset? Well, good first question. There are two fundamental building blocks of trust in business. And again, let's keep it simple. If you want to establish a trust-based relationship from the outset, you need to do two things. Number one is to be trustworthy, worthy of trust. And we have a little simple model called the trust equation, which I'll go through later, that categorizes four kind of key ways of being trustworthy, and we'll come back to that. So that's trustworthiness. That's the first thing. You have to be trustworthy to create trust-based relationships. The other thing is, and people don't mention this as much, you have to be willing to trust others yourself for a simple reason. If you don't trust anybody, guess what? Nobody's likely to trust you. And since the person who does the trusting is the one who initiates a trust interaction, if we want to create our own luck, create our own opportunities, we need to get better at trusting other people. So the foundation of a trust-based relationship is two things: be trustworthy and learn how to trust others. And it really is kind of that simple. Let me dive deeper into the trustworthiness part, which I mentioned the trust equation. It's really the trustworthiness equation. And bear with me, I'm going to describe this without an image, so you have to create the image in your own head. A four-factor equation, C plus R plus I over S. CRI divided by S. And those letters stand for credibility, reliability, intimacy. Those are all in the numerator. In the denominator, the S stands for self-orientation. Now, a very quick word about each of those. Credibility has to do with expertise, competence. Are you good at what you do? And, you should be fairly good at what you do. I'm going to assume you are. Obviously, that's an important part of trust. People don't trust you if they don't find you credible, although people do overemphasize that part. Second one, R, reliability, also fairly obvious. Do you do what you said you would do? Do you have a good track record of being on time, consistent, and so forth? The third one, a little unusual, intimacy, is quite different. The word intimacy here has to do with safety or security, in the sense that somebody feels comfortable sharing information with you. They don't think you're going to make fun of them or share confidential information. It's the safety of talking with you as a person and opening up. Now, all three of those are positive attributes. If you increase your levels of credibility, reliability, and intimacy, that all increases your trustworthiness. The other factor in the denominator goes the other way, self-orientation. The more self-oriented you are, the less trustworthy you are. And the less self-oriented you are, the more other-oriented you are, the more people will trust you. And we've developed a self-assessment tool. 500,000 people have taken it. There's some interesting findings that come out of it. For example, you might ask yourself this question: do we get more trustworthy with age? Do we get more trustworthy as we get older, or less? And the answer turns out to be more, for simple reasons. I think as we get older, we get more experience. That doesn't necessarily mean we get wiser or more trustworthy, but on the whole, on the average, it does. So that's one finding. The other one, which I find very interesting, you might ask, well, which is the most important factor? Now, most people that I work with come from the areas of professional services or B2B selling. So lawyers, accountants, consultants, actuaries, engineers, marketers, and of course, B2B salespeople. Most of those people think that the most important variable is going to be either credibility or reliability. And it turns out, if you look statistically at our survey results, 500,000 people, the most powerful factor turns out to be intimacy. Which surprises people. And again, most of the people that I deal with, that list of professions, they tend to be not very good at intimacy. So there's a big area of opportunity in that whole area of intimacy, and also within low self-orientation. Now, let's see, let me go through some of these other questions here. Building trust with tech clients. How can technology consultancy establish and maintain trust with clients, especially when dealing with complex and often data-sensitive technologies? Well, here's some good news. It's easier to build trust in those complicated data-intensive businesses than it is if you're selling low value, low price consumer items. And the reason is people need to trust. If you're a buyer, put yourself in a buyer's shoes, and you're setting out to purchase a complicated, expensive service where the results may be intangible and the seller knows more than you do, you're going to have to rely on trust. You're going to have to come to some kind of conclusion that I'm not an expert here, but this person is. I have to trust them. So it's not how you do it is all the things I mentioned before: trustworthiness and trusting. But if you're in a tech business, don't turn away from it. Trust is even more important in that kind of business. Third question: what advice would you give to leaders on earning and maintaining the trust of their team members? Well, again, trust between people, which is mostly what I'm talking about here, interpersonal trust, is the same no matter who you're dealing with. Whether it's your coworkers or your clients or your bosses or your subordinates, the dynamics are basically the same. There is a particular role, though, for leaders, which this question goes to. And again, I'll keep it simple. There are two things you need to do as a leader. And it's not metrics and managed by numbers and best practices and competency models. It's two things. Number one, it's role model. There are lots of areas in business where, if you say to people you should do this and you don't do it yourself, well, they raise their eyebrows a bit, but it's not the end of the world. But when it comes to trust, if somebody says you need to be trustworthy and they are not trustworthy, that's a big problem. That's hypocritical. We don't tend to trust or trust leaders who don't behave in trusting and trustworthy ways themselves. So that's number one. Be a role model. The power of role modeling in leadership is huge anyway. It's especially huge in trust. That's how we learn some of these things is from our leaders. The other thing that leaders can do is be alert to opportunities to teach people, by example, some organizational trust principles like transparency, collaboration, openness, focus on the client. I'll give you a brief example of what I mean by that. Some years ago, I was giving a talk at Accenture. It was a global meeting of all the world leaders, And before me on the stage was the CEO of Accenture at the time, Bill Green, no relation to me. They didn't let me in the room during his speech, but they let me in during the Q&A afterwards. And I guess the meeting had to do with a new organizational rollout. And one person in the room raised their hand and said, "Bill, great talk, but I have one question. Where do we stand on establishing the incentives to support this new rollout, so that if my friend from Australia over here calls me, I'm incented to support him?" And Bill Green walked to the front of the stage and pointed at the person and said, "I never want to hear that question again from anybody in this room. If there's ever a conflict between doing the right thing and following the incentives, you do the right thing first and fix the incentives later. Am I clear?" Well, 40 people in that room got very clear very quickly. Now, what Bill Green did in that moment, he heard an issue, a trust issue. It was, the right thing versus incentives, and he chose to walk right up towards it. He didn't evade it. He didn't pass it by. He said, "This is a clear trust opportunity. Do the right thing. That's the most important, and fix it later." And he said it, of course, with great drama. He didn't shy away from it. So that's what I mean by leading. Be a role model yourself and lead the charge when you see trust issues coming up. Let's see, here's another question. Trust-based selling in tech consultancies. How can the principles of trust-based selling be applied to selling technical and consultancy services where the outcomes are often not immediately visible? Well, let me talk specifically about what I call trust-based selling and what that means. Many of you listening to this have read sales books or been to sales training sessions, and I suggest to you the purpose in almost all of those books and training programs is to get you better at getting more sales. In fact, that may seem obvious to you, but think about it for a moment. Suppose that you are a customer and you meet with a salesperson from a consultancy, and their whole goal is to get you to buy from them. That is not customer-centric. That is seller-centric. And again, almost everybody in sales says, "Oh, we're customer-centric." Well, no, you're not. If your basic goal is to get money from the customer, that's not customer-centric. That's seller-centric. So much of sales is flawed right from the outset, right from the beginning. There's a problem there. And you might say, "Well, what's the alternative?" Well, here's the alternative. Do the right thing by the client, period. And let things go. Now, if you consistently do the right thing for a client, guess what? They will notice that and they'll say, "Gee, they're not trying to sell me. They're not trying to, get me to do anything I don't want. They're just being helpful. I like dealing with this person." In fact, let's turn that into a thought experiment. Imagine that you yourself listening to this, you have to buy personally some service. Maybe it's an HVAC system for your house, or maybe it's a healthcare facility for your parents, or maybe you need to hire a financial planner. Let's say that whatever it is, the service is expensive, it's important to you, and the seller knows more than you do. Well, now imagine in this thought experiment, and you go forward and you meet with this person and you talk with them, and as you work with them, you notice several things. You notice they don't seem to be in a hurry, and they're not working a schedule, they work your schedule. Number two, in all your conversations, they say many interesting things along the way. They're not trying to get you to close or buy. You don't get any sense of that. They seem to be pretty competent, but they don't make a big deal out of it. They constantly ask you what are your interests and your needs and your wants and your situation. And they always seem to be, focused on you and no pressure to buy. Now, isn't that the kind of salesperson that we all want to have? Isn't that the kind of salesperson that we want to buy from? And if you say yes to that rhetorical question, then the other question becomes, well, maybe we should sell that way. And that's what I call trust-based selling, doing the right thing for the client. Because if you consistently do the right thing for the client, many of them will end up buying from you. Maybe not in this particular moment, in this particular transaction, but the repetition of principled trust-based behavior makes an impression on people. And those are the people that, that want to end up buying from you. I'll give you a practical example of what this means. Ask yourself, what are the, several most problematic questions that you run into in sales. They might be things like, why should we buy from you? Or why are you so expensive? Or something like, well, let's take that one. Let's take, why are you so expensive? The usual answer is, well, we're not really that expensive if you look at the value that we provide. Something like that. We've all had answers like that. I would suggest to you that's not a very good answer. Customers don't feel good saying, no, you're wrong. We're actually very valuable. So if you reimagine that along the lines of the trust concept we've talked about, if a client says to you, gee, you seem awfully expensive, here's what I would suggest you say. We seem awfully expensive. Help me understand what you mean by that. I've heard that before, but sometimes it means I don't have the budget. Well, that could be a problem. Or sometimes it means that's more than I thought it was going to be. Or sometimes it could mean I got a quote from your competitor down the street and they were 30% less expensive than you. Or other times I found people just don't like to agree to the first quote they hear. They want to bargain and negotiate. So I'm not sure if what you mean when you say we're too expensive, whether it's one of those four things or maybe something else. So tell me more, help me understand what you mean by that, and maybe we can solve it and maybe we can't, but we'll figure it out together. So please talk to me more about what you mean when you say that. All right, end of example. Now, in that example, you'll notice that the dialogue has changed. The old usual answer, not really expensive because we're so valuable, that's treating it like a back and forth tennis match, like a competition. No, you're wrong. Here's the right answer. In the answer that I suggested, it's much more collaborative and questioning. You're asking the person, help me understand. I'm not sure I get it. It's my fault. It's on me. Help me understand what you mean by that. You're inviting the client to tell you more about where they're coming from. And by the way, it's a good question too. It isn't clear what people mean by that, even when they're asking it. So you teasing them out, having a dialogue about it is itself an act of collaboration and coordination. So anyway, that's a bit about trust-based selling. And it's much more important and in many ways easier to do in a complicated technical business as it is than, if you go in and you want to buy a $20 item at a retail store, you don't need a relationship. You don't need a lot of trust. And probably just about as much about that $20 item as the seller does. So these issues don't become so important. But if you're talking tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars of professional fees or something, the trust issues naturally come much more into play. Here's a good one. Measuring trust. I'm sure I hear this a lot. Is there a way to measure the level of trust between a consultancy and its clients? How can companies know they are moving in the right direction? Well, let me step way back here. A lot of business these days, I'd say for the past 40, 50 years, has been increasingly more data-driven, metricized, and measurable. You may have heard the phrase, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. That's ridiculous. Of course you can manage things even if you can't measure them. You can manage through fear and intimidation. You can manage through example. You can manage through storytelling. There are lots of ways. The role of metrics and numbers and quantification is overrated, in my opinion. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not important, but we put too much importance on it. I suggest to you, think about all of us here. We're all human beings. We're the product of millions of years of evolution, or maybe not millions, hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. And we're all pretty sensitive at picking up unspoken messages from other human beings. So I suggest to you, if you work on some of these trust ideas and get better at it, you're going to know, you're going to feel it with confidence that, when the relationship is better. You already know which of your relationships you would call more trusted than others. And I suggest, first of all, trust your instincts, trust your gut. It's a better measure than you think. That said, yes, there are some measurements. As I said, my firm, Trusted Advisor Associates, put together a self-assessment tool based on the trust equation. It's a 20-question tool. You can take it for free. and you get within 5 minutes, you get an answer back. Here's your trust score. More importantly, here's the elements that you scored well on, and here's where your opportunities are. So it gives you some practical, tactical ways to assess your own abilities. How do you track the success of a company's trustworthiness? Well, you could hire a PR firm, you can do a survey yourself, but I'd suggest to you the better learning comes not from tracking your metrics, but rather, constantly diving in and discussing amongst yourselves. How's it going? How is this relationship? How can we improve it? There's much more learning in that than just looking at numbers, which are inevitably a little bit flawed. One other point on the measurement thing. When it comes to credibility and reliability, 3 components in the numerator of the trust equation, those are fairly easy to measure. We have good measurements and tracking tools for credibility. We have credentials. People get degrees. People take courses. Reliability is even easier. You can track on time, on spec, on quality. Those are not hard to do. The hard ones are the intimacy and the low self-orientation. How do you measure somebody's subjective feeling in a dialogue? How do you measure taking a half second longer to ask a question? How do you measure the emotional tone in your voice when you say, ouch, that's got to hurt? Hard to measure. Easy to feel, easy to sense when it's there, hard to measure. And self-orientation is even worse. If you try and build incentives out of metrics for self-orientation, you run into a contradiction. Part of low self-orientation is not being selfish. Well, how would you incent people to not be selfish? Certainly not by giving them money. Here, we'll pay you money if you don't pay attention to money. You're better off using methods of management, like, as I said, storytelling. Listening is huge. Just improving your listening will probably do more than anything else to improve trust. All right, let's see. I'm looking at my good question list here. The role of transparency. How important is transparency in building trust between technology providers and their clients? Can you provide examples of how transparency can be effectively implemented? Yes, it's very important. I've evolved a list of 4 trust principles for organizations, kind of like the trust quotient for individuals. I won't go through them all, but one of them is transparency. And it basically means, are you keeping secrets or not? Nobody likes to think that they're being kept secrets unless they're told they are. That's fine. Transparency is huge. I'll give one example from early in my career. It was the first sales call I ever went on. It was for a B2B manufacturer of sandpaper and grinding wheels, abrasives, abrasivos is the category name. And my boss came along with me just to give moral support. So you know how these meetings go. You bring out some coffee, you exchange the business cards, and then it gets down to business. And the client leans into me and says, tell me, Mr. Green, how much experience do you have doing marketing studies for industrial consumables? And I thought, what is he talking about, industrial consumables? And then I thought, oh, right, sandpaper. Okay, right. But then I thought, oh my gosh, how much experience do we have doing marketing studies for sandpaper? I was pretty sure the answer was 0, like none. And I rapidly began to think, well, how do I talk my way out of this one? Not exactly, but we've done a lot of similar things in similar industries. Before I could say anything, my boss leaned in to the conversation. And remember, the question was, what experience do you have doing marketing studies for industrial consumables? And he said, none that I can think of. What else would you like to talk about? Well, I almost fell over. That's not what you say. You don't say none. But I looked at the client, and his reaction was instant. He leaned back, put his arms up, and obviously got very more comfortable. And he says, it's funny. Hardly anybody's done marketing studies in sandpaper. That's okay. What else have you got that we could talk about? And then, of course, I could say everything I was going to say in the first place, similar, but with a world of difference, because my boss had told the truth. More interesting, the truth was, we don't know anything about that. We haven't done it. Ironically, one of the most trust-creating things you can say is, I don't know. Who's going to doubt you when you say you don't know? Nobody. They're going to doubt everybody else who claims to know everything. And nobody knows everything. So being transparent about your own capabilities is one thing. Being transparent about your own feelings, being transparent about your own observations, being transparent about your pricing policies, anything you can do that's not illegal or against company policy. To be transparent is a positive thing for trust. I can't put that strongly enough. Let's see, a couple other questions here. Building trust across cultures. Operating in Brazil and the USA, for example, what are challenges and opportunities in building trust across different cultures and governance structures? There are challenges. There are cultural differences. You all are aware of them maybe more than I am. I've been to Brazil several times. I've lived for a year in Europe. I've traveled in Asia, South America. But I'm not a cross-cultural expert. Take an example, that last one I mentioned, of when you don't know something, say no. In Asian cultures, that's very difficult. It's just very hard for people to say, I don't know. And I have to back off and respect the culture and go up one level to general principles. The principle is, don't pretend to know things that you don't know. Now, you may have to find your own language to articulate that in ways that are culturally acceptable. But if you hold to the point, don't obfuscate, don't claim, don't lead people on. You'll find the right words to say it. Let's see, a couple other things. Trust in data management. In an era where data breaches are common, what strategies should companies adopt to build customer trust regarding data privacy and security? I think the most important thing is have a policy and be clear about what it is. The real problem is when there is no policy, or it's inadequately articulated, not adhered to, when there's vagueness. So you can be precise about imprecision. You can say, here's what, be as precise as you can and be as transparent as you can. The fact of having a policy already sets you apart from an awful lot of other people who haven't. I'm looking at my time here, and let's get one more question. One is, if there's one single piece of advice you could give to people to creating more trust in their relationships, what would it be? Well, I'll give you two. The first one is just listening. And I'm sure I'm hardly the first person to say listening is really important, but let me put a particular spin on it. When I talk about listening here, I'm not talking about listening to have great questions and learn the answers to those questions. I'm not talking about, reducing the number of questions through deduction so you can test a certain hypothesis. When I'm talking about listening, I'm talking about listening so that the other person feels heard, understood, appreciated, respected. You want to evoke an emotional reaction in the other person. And the way you listen is, first of all, you pay attention, clear your head out to, don't worry about the next question, pay attention, lean in, feel free to use facial gestures and verbal cues. As I said before, ouch is a full sentence. So is wow. And it's perfectly appropriate to lean in, raise your voice, and look them in the eye and say, wow, that's amazing. That must have been an incredible experience for you. That kind of interaction creates a lot of interpersonal trust with people. So listening is number one. I guess the other one, I'll go back to the two big parts of trust that I mentioned. There's trustworthiness and trusting. The essence of trusting, we haven't talked about that yet, is taking a risk. If there's no risk, it's not trust. It's just probabilities. You don't need trust. You need trust when somebody is taking some kind of a risk. So we could go much deeper into it, but I would just say examine your propensity to take risks and be willing to take a risk with the people you work with. Like, for example, I never told anybody this, or I've got to be honest with you, I'm a little nervous about, or gee, I could be wrong, but it seems like you're feeling this. Tell me more about that. Things that might feel a little bit risky, don't shut it down, don't not say it. Instead, find words to say things that are a little bit risk-taking. Because if you are willing to trust the other person, that greatly increases the odds that they will be willing to trust in you. And with that, I think I've probably taken up enough of your time. If any of you would care to speak with me further, follow up on this, you can reach me at LinkedIn, Charles H. Green, or my email address, which is cgreen, that's CGREEN, at trustedadvisor.com, TRUSTEDADVISOR.com. And with that, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to share these thoughts with you. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.